Greetings. Let me introduce myself. I am Jangya II, the second Jangya, known as Rolbe Dorje Yeshe Tanbe Durmi Palsangbo, born Tsunamdrakpa in 1717. In spite of my pretentious title, I was raised from very humble beginnings, born as I was to a village priest in Amdo, lying on the Tibetan border near Mongolia. I did not see my mother Ruki since I was recognized as a tulku, a reincarnated lama, and I was taken away to the monastery at a very young age. I was recognized as the second of what would become known as the Jangya lineage, having chosen to return to Mongolian Buddhist culture, part of the Gelugpa sect of the great Tsongkhapa. In my prior lifetime as the first Jangya, I was invited to Beijing at the request of the emperor himself. I began my monastic studies in Beijing after a Chinese military unit destroyed my home monastery of Qianlong. Though I studied primarily in Beijing, I also studied at the great monastic centers of Tibet, and was blessed to do so with the very seventh Dalai Lama, Kelsang Gyatso. I suppose the principal reason for my fame derives from the fact of my friendship with the greatest of the Manchu or Qing emperors, Qianlong. The prior emperor Yongzheng was favorable to Chinese Buddhism. He was attempting to assimilate Manchu culture with Chinese. My patron Qianlong lived from 1711 to 1799, and he turned from Chinese Buddhism to the Tibetan forms that my Mongol ancestors also embraced. Now I am known for having accomplished a number of things. I learned Manchu, Chinese, and Mongolian in order to spread the Gelugpa Madhyamaka doctrines to which I firmly cleave. I am principally known for my Siddhanta text, the beautiful ornament for the Mount Meru of the adept Buddhist teaching, a clear exposition presenting the limits of proofs. This type of text aims to present the positions of all the schools of Buddhism. I am especially proud of the work I did in elucidating principal themes of Yogacara doctrine. I became aware through my studies in China that Chinese Buddhism was mostly influenced by Yogacara tradition. I wanted to respond to the Chan scholars I came to know, and this fact propelled me to complete my great text. I began, in fact, the Yogacara section first. In this section, Ka, or the third section of my Drumta or Siddhanta work, I focus on the Yogacara notion that consciousness, alone among all other phenomena, exists as a fact, vastutaha in Sanskrit. Now the Yogacara school holds that something, for example, a cup, does not exist as an entity on its own. It is the basis, however, for the label cup. In their view, essence and particularity are falsely attributed to things. By applying a label to a thing perceived, we are imputing the essence of that thing. They hold that these things of the consciousness, the labels, the characteristics, and so forth, have intrinsic characteristics that they call swalakshana. So these names in the consciousness exist as facts. But when one ascribes such a thought label to a particular form one perceives, one has imputed or slapped on a label to something, but the name and that form perceived are not identical. This is the mistake the Hinayana or early schools made, assuming a one-to-one correspondence between names and things. Their realist position is an extreme view for the Yogacara and their doctrine of the emptiness or duality. The Dvaya Shunya of the Yogacara school is the ultimate perspective, or so they claim. As you already know from hearing my great predecessor, that second Buddha Tsongkhapa, the Gelugpa school holds the Madhyamaka tradition of the great Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, the Prasangika tradition. The Yogacharans accuse us of a kind of nihilism for rejecting any basis for the existence of anything whatsoever, even consciousness. They claim that by doing this we reject consciousness, and if this is so, we are rejecting the Buddha's path. Why? Because apart from consciousness, how could there be nirvana and liberation? As you already know, they claim the basis for everything is found in the principle of Paratantra, the enmeshment or interweaving of all phenomena with each other. Everything exists as dependent upon other than it for its existence, they claim. This is how they present praticca samutpada. This basis, or in Sanskrit ashraya, they claim, is a truly existent principle. This basis serves as a foundation for verbal characteristics and is, they say, an inexpressible nature that does indeed ultimately exist. They argue that were there no basis for conceptualization, even if it is illusory, then there would be no basis for the final goal, the perfected state known in Sanskrit as parinishpana svabhava. I quote a Sangha in my work from his Mahayana Sangraha, where he states, some Mahayanists erroneously cleave to these words. Conventionally, everything exists. Ultimately, everything does not exist. If everything is just concealing or conventional without a basis at all, then words would be sons of a barren woman, utterly unable to communicate anything without a source through which to give these words birth, as it were. The Yogacharans agree with us that entities are empty or zero of essence and inherent existence. For conceptualization is indeed a concealing level of truth for them. But at the ultimate level, in the most profound meditation of an Aryan Bodhisattva, the awareness of shunyata is real. And through this act of purified consciousness, suchness, and the ultimate level of truth is attained. Now, as a Madhyamika thinker, I find problems with this view. As my esteemed predecessor Nagarjuna maintained, there is no fact of consciousness beyond its name. He went so far as to compare it to magnetite that seems to shift position when iron is near, but in fact has no consciousness at all. One's consciousness is no more real than this. For example, with regard to karma, one must suppose that consciousness is just a mere denomination. If consciousness is comprised of essential characteristics, again, this swalakshana, then this implies boundaries among the conceptions in consciousness. If there is an inherent cupness in the thought of a cup, one implies a boundary between the thought of cup and not cup in the mind. If there were boundaries, then with regard to rebirth in the next life, one's thoughts would not be one's own. They would be bound by the conception of one person with his or her own intrinsically existent thought characteristics. But the boundaries among these thoughts, as inherently characterized, would of necessity be different from the thoughts of that person in the next life. Then we could say, look what has happened to me because that guy was a murderer. If we reject this idea of intrinsically existent thoughts and characteristics, then without boundaries, one's memories and consciousness would indeed flow seamlessly into the next life. This point applies to the sequence of consciousness in this life as well. In sum, while my respect for this great Mahayana school, this Yogacara tradition is enormous, I find their assertion of a foundationalism not an ultimate teaching. If there is a basis, foundation, or ground, an ashraya for existence, then what is the relationship of the basis to those things that emerge from that basis? Even if the basis is a designated rarefied principle, such as the other dependent or paratantra nature, then even as a concept, what is the relationship of being dependent upon other to that with which it is dependent? This implies the existence of inherent rather than strictly conventional bases for things. In the last section of my work, the Drumta, I spell out the Madhyamika response. The idea of any basis of anything whatsoever is a concept